In this episode, I will be talking about death, bodies and embalming, as well as show a body on screen. While it's not gory, it may be a little uncomfortable for younger viewers. If it is, it may be best to skip this week's video. President Lincoln was a well-respected and well-loved president. He believed in fair for all and that all his fellow men deserved the best he could give. Sadly, though, his views were not well received by some, and on the 14th of April 1865, while attending a play, Lincoln was mortally wounded by a bullet, his killer escaping out the stage door. Lincoln was taken to a house across from the theatre, where he fought valiantly for 8 hours as doctors battled to save him. Sadly, surrounded by his wife and friends, Lincoln passed away. While we have all heard of the assassination and how it happened, what is rarely spoke of is the aftermath and what happened to Lincoln. After the president passed away, his body was taken to Cleveland, Ohio, where he lay in state covered with a black silk shroud, while preparations were made for the train. Edwin Stanton knew the popular president would need a funeral for the ages, and knew that Lincoln would want the opportunity for everyone to see him and give him a fond farewell. It was planned that the train was to take the president home would be the same route that took him to the Capitol, stops and all. But Mary Lincoln, Abraham's wife, at first disapproved of the arrangements and just wanted to bring her husband home to Springfield, Illinois, but was eventually persuaded for the 1,700-mile train journey to go ahead. On the 21st of April, the bleak, dreary morning silence was only broken by the sounds of horses as they chomped at their bits. The horses, flanked by soldiers, pulled the hearse of their fallen leader to start his final journey. At the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad station, the 9-car train was waiting for them. George Pullman offered his own deluxe cars for the presidential family to use, and the coffin was loaded into Lincoln's presidential car. One addition that the family requested was that the president's son Willie, who had passed 3 years earlier from typhoid fever, travelled with him. The family had envisioned that they would bury their son at Springfield at the end of the president's tenure, so was stored in a vault in Georgetown. Once the president was aboard, 150 members of his closest family and friends boarded the train. Mary, however, was not among them. She was too distressed to attend and was told that she was welcome to stay at the White House as long as she needed, but she did give consent for the coffin to be open on public viewings. There was, however, one glaring problem. There was no refrigeration in the carriage for the 12-day trip, and the body had already laid in state. Charles Brown, a local embalmer, was tasked with looking after the body and seeing it in a viewable condition, a task made very difficult given the injury to the back of his head. Brown gave his promises that Lincoln would never know decay and that there would be no changes to the president's condition. The train carriage itself already had a history with Lincoln, but not in the way many would expect. After sensing that the Civil War was finally coming to a close, the U.S. Army Transportation Corps wanted to create a train especially for the president to travel in. The president, however, was less than impressed. He felt that a train for him was an unnecessary expense. But eventually he was persuaded for the carriage to be built. The car was 48 foot long and stunningly decorated with etched windows and crimson interiors. It was ironic that the car only took the president once, and that was for his final journey. Out of the 20 or so engines that pulled the funeral train on its journey, the Old National would be the most notable. The engine is a 440 American Standard locomotive built in 1851 by the Cuyahoga Steam Furnace Company. It was a mixed traffic engine and worked on the Cleveland, Columbus and Cincinnati Railroad, delivering passengers and goods and soldiers and supplies in the Civil War. No one really knows why Old Nashville was specifically chosen to pull the famous train, but it was cleaned to within an inch of its life and was decorated with black bunting and flags, while a picture of the late president was hung on the smokebox. The first stop the president made was one of the most ironic. It stopped in John Wilkes Booth's, Lincoln's assassin's, hometown of Baltimore. Before the assassination, the town was simply too dangerous for the president to visit when he was alive due to the brewing unrest and the mood of the town before and during the Civil War. If the president had no other option but to travel through the town, he would usually travel through in disguise, quietly passing through unnoticed. The town, though, was a vital stop, so under a feeling of unease and dread, the train was stopped and the body was unloaded into the horse-drawn hearse. They needn't have worried. The townspeople, horrified at Booth's actions, poured out in their thousands to pay their respects. Over 30,000 people in Baltimore alone filed past the open casket. The scene repeated itself in every stop the train visited. In Philadelphia, over 150,000 people paid their respects, while the president lay at the foot of the Liberty Bell, and even a 6-year-old Theodore Roosevelt looked on from his second-door window as the procession it went past in Manhattan, with 500,000 people following behind. With every passing stop, though, Charles Brown had to work harder and harder to limit the process of decay. He still insisted that the president was in perfect condition, but the press was skeptical. They noted the darkening skin was being hidden with chalk makeup, and the body was heavily perfumed to conceal the smell. Brown did everything possible to keep the viewings going, and each stop became more and more elaborate as people would camp along the railroad tracks for miles just to catch a glimpse of the train as it passed. As the train travelled further west, more and more people gathered around it. Women would board the train to lay wreaths. Bonfires were lit along the tracks to light the train at night, and in Richmond a 25-foot-high funeral arch was erected. Finally, after 1,645 miles, over 40 cities and towns, 1 million mourners and 13 days, Lincoln was finally home. Lincoln was put on one final viewing before his coffin was closed. Lincoln and his son were buried at the Oak Ridge Cemetery to a hero's welcome and an hour-long ceremony. For the first time ever in a presidential funeral, Lincoln's own horse, Old Bob, followed the procession. The horse was tacked up for his fallen master, with Lincoln's boots in the stirrups facing backwards, in a representation to a fallen commander looking back on his troops one last time. But this was not the end of the story for Lincoln or this train. Lincoln was actually moved no less than 17 times during his death. In 1876, a gang of men was caught removing the coffin from its vault in an attempt to ransom him, and Lincoln's son Todd decided he was not going to take any further chances with his father. In 1901, after completing Lincoln's tomb and memorial, the casket was moved and opened one last time. The 23 witnesses peered in and were surprised at how well he had been preserved. His skin was still chalky white, and he still had his hair and discernible features. His clothes were faded and covered with yellow mould, but they were still recognisable. After saying their goodbyes, the coffin was shut for the very last time, knowing no other human would ever look on him again, and Lincoln was laid to rest forever in a 10-foot grave surrounded by a steel cage and covered in concrete. But what about Lincoln's train and engine? I have scoured and scoured, and despite its fame, I can't find anything else on Old Nashville. There is another Old Nashville, but it was built in the 1940s. I can only assume that either the engine's name was changed, it was rebuilt, or was scrapped. If anyone else knows anything, please let me know. The presidential carriage, we have a bit of a better history. We know it was never used as a presidential carriage again and was put up for sale, eventually being purchased by the Union Pacific Railroad. It was stripped of its finery and transformed into a standard passenger coach. Over time, the stock was improved and the carriage ended up off the tracks and was used as a shed in Minnesota. Sadly, the carriage was destroyed in a fire a number of years later, bringing an end to its opulent life. Fast forward 150 years, however, and there may be some hope on the horizon of bringing the old train back to its glory. In 1999, Dave Cloak from Illinois wanted to recreate a fully working standard gauge steam engine. He decided, due to the important anniversary, he would not only recreate the train, but the carriages as well. The task was difficult and sometimes impossible, as no known photos exist of the train's interior. A lot depended on plans, but in 2015, both it and Cloak's engine, Leviathan, hit the rails on a 12-city tour. It now calls home in Lancaster County, as well as many museums it gets to visit. The 16th President of the United States was an incredible man. He was tall, but many said he had a kind face, and he cared deeply for his country and its people. In his 4 short years as president, he led the country through a civil war, abolished slavery, helped shape modern economics, and even today his speeches reside in the heart of many Americans. Even though his tenure as president was needlessly cut short, he aspired to a place that many other presidents could only dream of. Thanks to Dave Cloak and many of the hundreds of museums and monuments dedicated to his memory, President Lincoln remains to this day as one of the most incredible world leaders in history.